December 14, 1944, Palawan Island, the Philippines. Late afternoon, the sky above Puerto Princesa was the particular shade of blue that the South China Sea produces in the dry season. Deep, almost violet at the edges, the kind of sky that looks painted rather than real. The air smelled of salt and diesel and the particular dampness of a tropical island that never fully dries out even in its dry months. Coconut palms lined the edges of the compound. Somewhere beyond the wire, the ocean was visible in fragments between the trees, flat and bright in the late afternoon light. The men inside the compound had learned, over the months of their captivity, not to look at the ocean too long. It was too far away to mean anything, and meaning things that were too far away was a luxury that prisoners of war in a Japanese camp on a remote Philippine island could not afford. You stayed close to what was in front of you. You stayed close to the next meal, the next roll call, the next day. There were approximately 150 American prisoners of war inside the Puerto Princesa camp on Palawan that afternoon. They were survivors of the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor, men who had fought and surrendered and endured more than 2 years of captivity under conditions that had already killed thousands of their fellow soldiers. They were weak. They were malnourished. They were, by any measure, men who had already given almost everything a man can give. They had survived this long. They believed, with the particular desperate logic of survival, that surviving this long meant something, that it was building toward something, that the war, which they could hear in the distance on certain nights, was moving in a direction that might eventually reach them. They were right about the direction. They were wrong about what would reach them first. To understand what happened at Palawan on December 14, 1944, you have to understand the position the Japanese military command found itself in by the closing months of that year. The American advance across the Pacific had accelerated through 1944 with a momentum that Japanese strategic planners had not fully anticipated and could not fully counter. Island by island, the perimeter that Japan had established after Pearl Harbor was being compressed. MacArthur's forces were moving through New Guinea. The Navy was moving through the Central Pacific. By October 1944, American forces had landed at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, and the largest naval battle in history had been fought and decided in American favor. The Philippines, the archipelago that Douglas MacArthur had been forced to abandon in 1942 with his famous promise to return, were being returned to. Palawan was strategically significant. The island sits at the western edge of the Philippine archipelago, long and narrow, extending southwest toward Borneo, with the South China Sea on one side and the Sulu Sea on the other. The Japanese had been using the prisoners at Puerto Princesa as forced labor to construct an airfield, a project that had consumed more than 2 years of the prisoners' captivity and an uncountable expenditure of their physical reserves. The airfield was operational. The prisoners who had built it were still in the camp. In November 1944, a directive moved through the Japanese military command structure. It was not a new directive. Variations of it had existed since earlier in the war. A standing order governing what was to be done with prisoners of war in the event that Allied forces approached their location. The directive was called, in the bureaucratic language of the Japanese military administration, the kill-all order. Its meaning was not ambiguous. No prisoner was to be allowed to fall into Allied hands alive. No prisoner was to be permitted to be liberated, to return home, to speak about what they had seen and experienced in Japanese captivity. The guards at Puerto Princesa were informed of the order. They were Japanese army personnel, trained soldiers who understood the laws of war, who understood that the men inside the wire were unarmed prisoners who had formally surrendered and who were protected under international convention. They understood all of this. The order was given anyway. Among the men inside that compound was Sergeant Willie Smith, 24 years old, from Morgantown, West Virginia. He had been a rifleman with the 192nd Tank Battalion, one of the units that had fought on Bataan before the surrender in April 1942. He had survived the Bataan Death March. He had survived more than 2 years of captivity. He was, by December 1944, thin in the way that long-term malnutrition produces not the dramatic thinness of acute starvation, but the deep, structural thinness of a body that has been slowly consuming itself for years. He was 24 years old, and he looked older than that. He was unarmed. He was a prisoner. He was protected by every law that the civilized world had established governing the treatment of men in his position. The guards at Puerto Princesa knew exactly what he was. They had administered this camp for months. They had overseen his labor on the airfield. They had processed his rations and counted him at roll call and recorded his prisoner number in their administrative logs. There was no confusion possible about what he was or what his status required of them. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon on December 14, 1944, air raid sirens sounded at the Puerto Princesa camp. This was not unusual. American aircraft had been active in the area, and air raid drills had become a routine feature of camp life. The prisoners were directed, as they had been directed before, toward a series of covered trenches that had been dug along one edge of the compound. Shelters intended, nominally, to protect the prisoners during air attacks. The prisoners moved toward the trenches. Some of them may have noticed in those final minutes that something was different about this particular alert. The guards were moving differently. There was a quality to the activity around the perimeter of the camp that did not match the practiced rhythm of a drill. Some of the men later described, in the testimony that a small number of survivors would give, a feeling, not quite a thought, more a physical sensation. D'André, that something was wrong. The trenches had been sealed with corrugated metal roofing and covered with additional material. The prisoners were directed inside. The entrances were blocked behind them. Then the guards poured aviation fuel into the trenches and set them on fire. The men inside the trenches who were not immediately killed by the fire attempted to break out. Some succeeded in forcing their way through the blockades at the trench entrances. Those men were met by guards positioned around the perimeter of the compound with rifles and fixed bayonets. Some prisoners were shot as they emerged. Some were bayoneted. Some were beaten. A small number, 11 men in the final accounting, managed, through a combination of desperate effort and the chaos that the situation produced even for the perpetrators, to breach the perimeter wire and reach the cliffs at the edge of the compound that dropped toward the ocean below. Those 11 men went over the cliff. Some of them were injured by the fall. Some of them were injured by the gunfire that followed them over the edge. They hit the water and they swam, and the guards fired at them from the cliff top. And some of them were hit in the water and did not surface again. And some of them reached the rocks below the cliff line and hid there in the darkness as the sounds from above continued. Of the approximately 150 American prisoners of war held at Puerto Princesa on Fiji, December 14, 1944, those 11 men were the only survivors. Stories like this one deserve to be told completely and without flinching. With every name recovered, every fact verified, every act of deliberate concealment exposed. If that's the kind of history you want to keep finding, subscribe. This channel exists to make sure these records survive. The Japanese command moved quickly to manage what had happened. The bodies of the prisoners were buried. The physical evidence of the trenches was addressed. Administrative records related to the prisoners held at Puerto Princesa were, in some cases, destroyed or altered. The official position, communicated through the Japanese military administrative structure, was that the prisoners had died during an American air raid, that they had been caught in the compound during a bombing, and that the deaths were the result of enemy action rather than deliberate execution. It was a calculation built on a specific assumption that no one who had witnessed what actually happened would survive to contradict it. The calculation was wrong by 11 men. The survivors who had gone over the cliff and reached the water made their way. Over the following days, through extraordinary physical circumstances, 713 toders madrunst, injured without food or fresh water, moving through jungle terrain on a remote island behind enemy lines. Naitit, toward the Filipino resistance networks that operated throughout the Philippine archipelago. The Filipino guerrilla units that found them provided shelter, medical attention, and eventually communication with Allied forces. The survivors' accounts began moving through intelligence channels within weeks of the massacre. By early 1945, those accounts had reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Douglas MacArthur, 64 years old, born in Little Rock, Arkansas, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, received the intelligence reports on the Palawan Massacre at his headquarters in the Philippines, where American forces had landed at Luzon in January 1945. He read them with the particular attention that a commander gives to intelligence that changes the operational picture. Uder Sanandradoin, not just as information about a single incident, but as confirmation of a pattern that the reports from multiple locations across the Pacific had been building toward 4 months. The kill-all order was not a Palawan-specific phenomenon. Reports from other liberated areas, from survivors of other camps, from Filipino resistance sources, had been assembling a picture of a systematic Japanese policy governing the fate of Allied prisoners as the military situation deteriorated. Palawan was the most complete and most documented example of that policy in its full execution. Cetriques, the only case where survivors existed to provide first-hand testimony of what the order looked like when it was carried out. MacArthur set the reports down. He read them again. He was not a man given to visible emotional display. His command style was theatrical in certain respects, carefully constructed for effect. But the theatricality sat on top of a calculating operational intelligence that processed information in terms of what it required rather than what it felt like. What the Palawan reports required was clear. He said to his intelligence chief quietly that they needed to move faster. The concern was not abstract. If the kill-all order was standing policy, then every Allied prisoner of war held in Japanese camps across the Philippines and across the broader Pacific theater was in danger from the moment Japanese commanders in their area determined that liberation was imminent. The race between the American advance and the execution of that order was already underway. The margin of time available to the prisoners in those camps was determined entirely by how quickly American forces could reach them. MacArthur ordered the acceleration of planning for a series of rescue operations targeting known prisoner of war camps throughout the Philippines. The most famous of these, Chui, the Cabanatuan raid, conducted by Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas in January 1945, would become one of the most celebrated special operations of the Pacific War. But the operational thinking behind it, the urgency that drove its planning and its timing, was inseparable from what the Palawan reports had confirmed about what happened to prisoners when liberation arrived too late. The investigation into the Palawan Massacre began in parallel with the rescue operations. The 11 survivors were debriefed extensively. Their testimony was taken by investigators operating under MacArthur's command and by personnel from the Judge Advocate General's office attached to the Southwest Pacific Theater. The accounts were detailed, consistent, and specific in the way that eyewitness testimony of traumatic events tends to be specific. Particular guards remembered by face and by the actions they had taken, the sequence of events reconstructed with the precision of men who had been fully conscious and observant during the worst minutes of their lives. The names of the Japanese officers commanding the Puerto Princesa garrison on December 14, 1944 were identified. The chain of command that had transmitted the kill-all order was traced upward through the administrative structure of the Japanese military. The investigation produced a documented evidentiary record that named names, established command responsibility, and traced the decision that had produced the massacre back through the layers of authority that had authorized it. MacArthur was explicit about what he intended to do with that record. He had been explicit about accountability for war crimes since the early stages of the Pacific Campaign, and the Palawan Massacre, with its surviving witnesses and its documented chain of command, provided exactly the kind of evidentiary foundation that a formal legal proceeding required. The machinery moved. Slowly, as it always moves, but it moved. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, as it became commonly known, convened in May 1946 and continued through November 1948. It addressed the full range of Japanese war crimes across the Pacific theater, from the Nanking Massacre of 1937 through the final months of the war. The Palawan Massacre was part of the evidentiary record presented to the tribunal, including the testimony of survivors and the documentation of the kill-all order and its transmission through the Japanese military command structure. Tribunal's proceedings established command, responsibility at the highest levels of the Japanese military and civilian government for the systematic mistreatment and murder of Allied prisoners of war. 7 defendants were sentenced to death and executed in December 1948. 16 others received life sentences. The kill-all order and the evidence of its execution at Palawan and elsewhere was central to the prosecution's case for the systematic and deliberate nature of the crimes, rather than isolated incidents of individual misconduct. At the field level, the officers directly responsible for the Puerto Princesa massacre were subject to separate proceedings before American military commissions. The commanding officer of the Japanese garrison at the time of the massacre, Captain Kojima Yoshio, was tried, convicted, and executed. The proceedings were not conducted with the visibility of the Tokyo Tribunal, but they were conducted with the same evidentiary standard: testimony, documentation, established chain of command, confirmed facts. The relentlessness that MacArthur had promised in his response to what Palawan represented was not rhetorical. It was procedural. It was the application of sustained institutional pressure through legal mechanisms over a period of years, producing convictions and sentences and a permanent record that named the people responsible and documented what they had done. Willie Smith, the sergeant from Morgantown, West Virginia, was not among the 11 survivors. He was among the men who died in the trenches on December 14, 1944, or in the minutes immediately after, on the cliff top or in the water below it. His name appears in the official casualty records. His family in Morgantown received the notification that comes to the families of men who die in captivity: a document, a date, a cause of death that, in the official military language of that moment, was recorded as death while a prisoner of war. The full account of what had happened to him and to the other men in that compound, the trenches, the fuel, the fire, the guards on the cliff top, would not reach his family in any complete form until after the war ended and the survivors' testimony had been processed and the investigation had produced its findings. The gap between what the family knew and what had actually happened was months wide, and crossing it required someone to sit down and write a letter, or make a phone call that no one wanted to make. His name is in the record. The record is held in the National Archives. The survivor's testimony that describes what happened to the men who did not make it over the cliff is part of that record. Specific, documented, signed. The 11 men who survived went home. Some of them testified at the tribunal proceedings. Some of them spoke publicly about what they had seen in the years immediately after the war, and then, as survivors of extreme events often do, went quiet about it for long stretches of time. Because the world after the war was trying to move forward and there was a pressure, subtle but persistent, to move forward with it. Some of them came back to it later, in interviews given in the 1980s and 1990s, when they were old men and the distance had done something different to the memory. Not softened it exactly, but clarified it, stripped away everything that wasn't essential, and left the essential thing standing clearly. What they said, consistently, was that they wanted people to know what the men who didn't survive had been subjected to. Not for the sake of anger, though anger was present, for the sake of the record, for the sake of the 139 men who had no one to speak for them except the 11 who had gone over the cliff and come back up again. MacArthur made his promise in 1942 standing on a dock in Australia, having been ordered to leave his men behind on Bataan. He said he would return. He returned in 1944, wading ashore at Leyte in a piece of theater so calculated it became one of the iconic images of the Pacific War. What is less visible in that image, but no less real, is what came after. The investigation, the tribunal, the military commissions, the relentless procedural pressure applied through legal mechanisms over years to ensure that what had been done to the men at Puerto Princesa and at Cabanatuan and in the camps across the Philippines and across the Pacific was documented, prosecuted, and permanently entered into the record of what this war had produced. It was not perfect justice. It was never going to be perfect justice. Some of the men responsible were never found. Some lived into old age without being charged. The Tokyo Tribunal itself has been criticized by legal scholars for aspects of its procedure and its selective application of accountability. These are legitimate criticisms, and they belong in the record alongside everything else. What also belongs in the record is that 11 men went over a cliff into the South China Sea and survived and came back and spoke, and that someone wrote it down, and that the writing has lasted. These stories belong to the people who lived them and to the people who didn't survive them. Told completely, with every name that can be recovered, every fact that can be verified, every act of deliberate concealment pulled into the light where it can be examined. If that work matters to you, subscribe, not as a transaction, as a commitment to the kind of memory that doesn't let the erasure win. The 11 men went over the cliff. The record came back with them, and it is still here.